When we hear the word gladiator, we imagine brutal battles, roaring crowds, and the grand stone walls of the Colosseum echoing with cheers. But behind those warriors, behind the blood, fame, and fear, there were people who lived a much quieter, more painful story. Their wives. These women didn't wear armor or hold swords, but they carried a different kind of battle in their hearts. A battle of waiting, of hoping, of fearing the worst. Every time the gates of the arena opened, they held their breath. Every scream from the crowd could mean victory, or the end. This is the untold chapter of ancient Rome, where love and fear walked hand in hand, where women stood outside the arena, praying that the man they loved would come out alive. Their story is one of strength, silence, and survival. Love in the shadows of the arena. Being married to a gladiator wasn't a dream, it was a daily gamble with fate. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals forced to fight for entertainment in the massive arenas of ancient Rome. Their lives were controlled by their masters, and their marriages were often not legally recognized by the Roman state. This meant gladiator wives had no legal protection, no property rights, and no social standing. If their husbands died in the arena, they could lose everything overnight. Their home, belongings, and even their children could be taken away. Society didn't see them as real wives, only as attachments to men destined for bloodshed. And yet, love still found a way. Some women chose to be with gladiators, drawn to their strength, bravery, and the strange fame they carried. Others were already married before their husbands were captured or forced into the arena. Their love stories were lived in silence, in the shadows of danger, surrounded by fear. They loved men who walked toward death every time they entered the arena, never knowing if they'd return. This quiet love, built on courage and hope, became one of the most hidden but powerful parts of the gladiator's world. Fame and fear, a dangerous mix. In the brutal world of the arena, some gladiators rose far above the rest. Men like Spartacus became legends, their names whispered in the streets and celebrated in the stands. Their strength, skill, and bravery made them more than fighters. They became symbols of power and rebellion, admired even by the noble class. For these famous gladiators, fame was both a blessing and a curse. They were adored by crowds, treated like celebrities, and their victories were celebrated like royal triumphs. Women from noble and wealthy families often fell in love with these warriors, enchanted by their daring and dangerous lives. It was a strange twist of Roman society. Men who were slaves could be desired more than free men. But fame came with a heavy price. The more popular a gladiator became, the more often he was forced to fight. A skilled and famous warrior was worth more to the owners, not because they cared for him, but because he brought in more money and bigger crowds. Each victory made him more valuable, but also increased the risk. Sooner or later, every gladiator faced a fight he might not survive. For their wives, every roar of the crowd was like the ticking of a clock, each cheer pulling them closer to the moment they feared most. They would stand among thousands, unable to help, their hearts pounding as they watched the man they loved step onto the sands. Each match was a cruel game of chance. Victory meant survival, for now. Defeat meant heartbreak, poverty, or worse. And then there was jealousy. Fame attracted attention, not just from strangers, but from powerful women in society who saw gladiators as exciting, forbidden lovers. Wives had to endure the pain of knowing their husbands were admired, desired, and sometimes taken by others. Their private love was often shared with a world that cheered for his blood. This emotional storm, fear, jealousy, and uncertainty, made their lives painfully complicated. A gladiator's fame didn't protect his family. In fact, it often puts them in even greater danger. The more the world loved him, the less control his wife had over his fate. In ancient Rome, fame wasn't freedom. For the wives of gladiators, it was a beautiful mask over a brutal truth. Every cheer from the crowd was a reminder that their husbands belonged to the arena, not to them. Life outside the arena. While their husbands trained or fought, gladiator wives lived in a world that society rarely noticed. Their homes were usually near the gladiator schools, known as ludi, large training grounds where men prepared for brutal combat. These areas weren't elegant Roman villas. They were rough neighborhoods, often dirty and crowded. Life was a daily battle for survival. These women built simple lives around uncertainty. forming small communities with other wives, lovers, and families of gladiators. They leaned on each other for support because no one else cared for their struggles. Together, they cooked meals, raised children, shared their fears, and found comfort in shared pain. Every day, they lived with the same haunting thought. Their entire world depended on the survival of one man in the arena. If he died, everything could be taken from them. Work was scarce, and many women were forced to live in poverty, relying on scraps or small jobs just to keep their children fed. But in this hardship, there was also remarkable strength. These women weren't warriors, but they fought their own invisible battles against fear, against society's judgment, and against a world that saw them as outsiders. They were often looked down upon because their husbands were slaves or criminals, no matter how famous they became. And yet, they endured. They held families together, they raised children, they kept hope alive. Their courage was quiet but unbreakable, a strength that history rarely talks about. While the world celebrated the gladiators, it was their wives who carried the pain, waiting outside the arena, holding their breath, and living in the long, cold silence after the cheers faded away. Widows of the arena. When a gladiator died, his wife's suffering didn't end. It truly began. In a society where gladiators were seen as property rather than men, their wives were left completely powerless. Without legal rights, most widows were treated like they didn't matter. They could be evicted from their homes, stripped of any belongings, or even sold along with whatever remained of their husband's possessions. Some were forced into remarriage, not out of choice, but because it was the only way to survive in a harsh, unforgiving world. For many women, the most painful moment came after the final fight. When the crowd had left, the sand was stained with blood, and the cheers had turned to silence. Some wives were allowed to collect their husbands' bodies as a final act of love. They would wrap them in cloth, weeping quietly, giving them the only dignity they could. It was a goodbye filled with pain, but at least it was a goodbye. But not everyone was given that mercy. Many women were denied access to the bodies of their husbands. Dead gladiators, especially those who were slaves, were sometimes treated like broken weapons, discarded without ceremony, thrown into mass graves, or left in places unfit for any kind of honor. Their wives had no say, no rights, and no voice. They mourned in silence, standing outside the walls of the arena that had stolen their future. There were rare moments of hope. A few gladiators managed to win their freedom after years of survival and victories in the arena. If they lived long enough to earn their wooden sword, known as the rudis, they could leave the blood behind and start a new life. In those lucky cases, their wives could finally step out of the shadows, living as free women alongside free men. But these stories were the exception, not the rule. For most, the love story ended on the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum. Thousands of women became widows overnight, left with nothing but grief and fading memories. Their husbands were remembered as warriors, but the women who mourned them were forgotten. These widows carried pain quietly. No statues were built for them, no songs were sung in their name. Their tears fell on the same ground where the crowds once cheered. And yet, in their quiet endurance, they showed a kind of strength that no sword could ever match. Love that history forgot. Roman history books are filled with the names of great emperors, mighty generals, and legendary gladiators. We know their battles, their victories, their rebellions. But what we rarely hear are the stories of the women who stood outside the arena, waiting, fearing, and loving in silence. These wives were not just passive figures in someone else's story. They were survivors. They lived through poverty, judgment, fear, and unbearable loss. While the world watched their husbands fight to the death for entertainment, these women fought their own battles in the shadows, to keep their families together, to protect their children, and to hold on to hope when hope was all they had. They stood by the arena gates, knowing that their entire life could change in a single swing of a sword. And when it did, they bore the pain quietly because society gave them no voice. Their names weren't carved on monuments, their stories weren't recorded by Roman historians, but their presence shaped the human side of the gladiator world. Without them, the story of gladiators is incomplete. For every man who fought, there was someone who waited. For every roar of the crowd, there was a woman holding her breath. For every death, there was a silent scream that history chose not to remember. Today, we can give those women something they were denied in their time: recognition. They may not have carried swords or worn armor, but their strength was unshakable. Their love and endurance left a mark not on stone, but on the human heart. The story of the gladiators isn't just about strength, blood, and glory. It's also about love, sacrifice, and the lives lived in the shadows. The wives of gladiators carried the weight of battles they never fought. Their voices may have been silent in history, but today they can be heard. So what do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated.